The world I was born into seems like a distant past compared to now. My name is Owen Jones from Toronto. When I was born in June of 2020, my parents had spent months living in a global pandemic in Toronto. Citizens were taking extreme measures of precaution. I didn't meet any of my family members living across the border in the United States until I was almost 2 years old. In retrospect, I think just about anyone would tell you that the COVID 19 pandemic exposed issues with healthcare, food security, and global production systems. When my mother was laid off from her job at a local tea shop, my parents began growing potted plants on our apartment balcony. Just small things like tomatoes, herbs, and lettuce to help put food on the table. I don't remember much about the first 10 years of my life, to be honest with you, but I do remember a sort of panic that built up amongst citizens. It was this realization that we really needed something big to happen or to change to keep us afloat. There were a lot of folks below the poverty line, a lot of folks who were generally pretty unhappy with the lack of action the government was willing to take. Now, my family squeezed by, made ends meet, but I remember many of my friends from school were not quite so fortunate. A lot of kids not having a lunch to eat at school, that sort of thing. Graduating high school was the most daunting, I'd say. I didn't have enough money for college or university. So I just threw myself out into the world and started working and saving. I spent some time just outside the city on a farm, and I met Jessica, who I ended up marrying. Like my family and friends, her family was struggling as well. Food was getting pretty costly. I remember when Jessica and I rented our first apartment together. Must have been 2 years after high school. We went to do a grocery run to stock up our fridge when we moved in, since we saw a store down the road had a sale going on. Turns out we were too late. The whole store was ravaged. We ended up eating beans and toast for dinner again that night. It took me 3 years to save for college, but I did end up studying climate risk management in a 2-year program, class of 2042. I'd grown up in an environment where people were marching for climate justice and systemic equality from the day that I was born. Grew up in a family feeling the effects of climate crisis and food sustainability issues, so it seemed like an easy choice for me. It wasn't until around and throughout the 2050s, I believe, until solar and wind energies had begun replacing the majority of fossil fuels. That's non-renewable energies for those of you who were born after 2075. There was a lot of green tech too, actually. They say what sparked this change was when this little strip of land that connected Nova Scotia to New Brunswick flooded, which was what made Nova Scotia the island we know it to be today. This was not the only irreversible damage that had been done, of course. I remember my friend Jack's family farm had to stop growing vegetables because the soil just outside of town had been contaminated with runoff from nearby chemical plants. Some of the damage was still being done at this point too. The Canadian government continued to support monoculture agriculture, both domestically and overseas, the last major industry reliant on fossil fuels. Jessica and I were married and had our first child in 2058. At the time, she was on leave of absence from work, and I was working at the same job I picked up after college, doing environmental consulting for a local construction company. We lived in a small apartment, but felt like home. We named our first son James, and my daughter Taboho came just 2 years later. 2 children was a definite financial strain, but it was worth it. This was all around the time when we saw a real cultural and political shift. We moved from an interest in protecting the environment through policy and green energy usage to really really cementing our relationship with nature as an integral part of our social fabric, which was a really big difference from the mindset I had been used to. There was this idea of ecological reciprocity that was popularized by the government at that time. Monoculture agriculture and the farms, they were seen as places that did not serve the ecosystems that they resided in. And the government started to incentivize farmers to move to more urban settings so that the land could be rewilded. Most refused initially, but plenty of smaller farmers who were struggling beforehand, like Jack's family, seemed happy with the move. That alone took almost 10 years to sort out deals with the most resistant of farmers. It ended up being a good thing, the moving of farmers to a more urban setting. But the period of time where the transition was taking place took a toll on all of us. Some farmers outright left their farms and it caused friction in the job market and just made the strain on food even worse, honestly. At least for a few years it did before things were sorted out. We were all looking at ways to produce more of our own food. Jessica and some of the other folks in our apartment tried to organize a garden on the rooftop to help bring in some more food for our building. They pooled money, bought all sorts of soil, seeds, and tools. I remember the day the landlord came knocking on our door, informing us that he was ripping it all out. There was no way the rooftop was allowed to be used for that. So we had a hard time finding fresh fruit and vegetables, maybe more so than before. So most of our meals revolved around breads and pastas, which were still relatively cheap to purchase. When Taboho and James were in their early 20s, there was a series of public displays that were pushing for the conversion of public and private green spaces in areas where food could be grown. Since even then, there were many going hungry. Lots of locally owned businesses were on board. Some of the golf courses and front lawn areas of stores and retirement homes would install and support community-led gardens. Then the government started taking an interest in local agricultural projects. There was an increase in local funding for social programs, investments in food forests, funds allocated to ensure soil and air quality for community gardens were as safe as possible. We really started to feel like more of a community. It was like this big veil of darkness had been lifted from our lives. This is where I'd say we truly rerouted our city's trajectory, because this all led to the eventual planning and the first slow steps toward the creation of the food library. We had local agricultural systems being nationalized. The federal government facilitated the creation of a board for local leaders. And the municipal government was replaced by a board of elected community members, giving the locals more autonomy over their gardens while having the financial support of the federal government. It wasn't well received by all at first. There were a lot of folks who were stubborn or hesitant. Honestly, folks who viewed the government as the same entity that neglected its people decades ago. But as it started to come together, as we started to see standardized pay for community garden workers and construction of the food library, where we could all access a seemingly never-ending supply of local food, people warmed up to this idea. That just about brings us to this decade, no? 2100, and the food library has been officially established for 10 years. No one's had to go hungry since, although there are certainly some produce we can't grow locally, and I sure do miss that. And it's more than just food at the library, of course. Education and access to seeds to start your own gardens. It's what truly helped my grandchildren get into gardening and growing fresh vegetables. It took us a while to get here, but I am certainly glad we did.